What we just heard is the testimony of a veteran who was inside Leyte's floating hell, the largest naval battle of the 20th century. In October 1944, the United States and Japan clashed in a fight of unprecedented violence. More than 300 ships and thousands of aircraft faced off. Between 10,000 and 12,000 Japanese sailors died. The United States lost 6 ships and more than 3,000 men. 2 years earlier, forced to flee, General Douglas MacArthur promised he would return, and he did. He landed on Leyte as a symbol of hope and, above all, of revenge. Surrender was not an option for the Japanese, and that week of fighting in the Pacific splintered into 4 parts. In each, a different war was fought, but every one was just as bloody.
When MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines, it was a hazardous escape. When he returned, as he said he would, it was with a powerful invasion armada. With him, off the island of Leyte, is Lieutenant General Kenny, his air commander, watching the bombardment before the landings.
In the heart of the Philippine archipelago, the island of Leyte sits between the Philippine Sea and the Celebes Sea, like a natural bridge between Asia and the Pacific. Whoever controlled Leyte would command the flow of oil, minerals, and the vital roots of the Japanese Empire. They knew it in Washington, and they knew it in Tokyo. That is why, when the Allies began the landing, Japan staked everything, its remaining fleet, its air arm, and its last hope of reversing the course of the war. The United States, for its part, was not only advancing to strangle the enemy, it was also fulfilling a promise. More than 200,000 men were preparing to decide the fate of the Pacific in a series of colossal clashes. The water was about to boil, and the fleet was ready.
They still have plenty of carriers and aircraft. U.S. admirals also have battleships and cruisers at their disposal. They feel they have enough strength at this point in the war to finally target the Philippines.
When it did, the battle erupted on 4 simultaneous fronts: Surigao, Engaño, Samar, and Sibuyan. The last of these, where the sea's dark waters saw the beginning of disaster. On October 24, 1944, the main body of the Japanese combined fleet sailed there, led by Musashi, the pride of the empire and one of the most imposing battleships ever built. She measured over 260 meters in length and carried 9 460mm main guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. As if that were not enough, she bore an almost impenetrable armor belt that made Musashi more than a weapon. It was a symbol. Nonetheless, that day neither her size nor her legend would serve as a shield. Americans, watching every Japanese move from the air, identified the Colossus as she crossed the San Bernardino Strait. Throughout the day, 3 successive waves of aircraft took off from the carriers of Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet. More than 200 aircraft, among them Avenger torpedo bombers and Helldiver dive bombers, launched coordinated attacks against Musashi and her escort. Hell broke loose on deck. The first torpedoes smashed into the port side, slowing the Giant. They were followed by 1,000-pound bombs that detonated between turrets and hangars. But the Japanese Giant did not yield. Damage control teams responded, and her crew fought to keep her afloat. The second wave punched through her again. The third finished what the previous ones had begun. In 7 hours of brutal attack, Musashi took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Even so, she did not sink immediately. She took hours to die, while survivors battled fires, flooding, and absolute chaos. Finally, at 1930, listing and powerless, her compartments blown out, the steel monster slipped beneath the waves, taking more than 1,000 crewmen with her. The sinking of Musashi was both a psychological and strategic blow. Although the Japanese fleet still retained firepower, its center of gravity had been shaken. It was the first great sign that control of the air no longer belonged to them. The Sibuyan Sea had spoken, and with a violence that foreshadowed the rest of the storm. With Musashi out of action, Japan needed more than guns. It needed cunning, so the board shifted in silence. The Japanese Empire knew it could not win by brute force, so it turned to its oldest weapon, deception. While Musashi sank in the Sibuyan Sea, the Japanese High Command executed a desperate gambit. It split its fleet into 4 groups. The weakest of them, under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, headed north on a suicide mission to draw the powerful U.S. Third Fleet toward Cape Engano at the northeastern tip of Luzon. It was a trap, a floating bait. Ozawa had barely 4 carriers, and many of their aircraft were unserviceable or lacked experienced pilots. In truth, his force was a shadow of what Japanese naval aviation had once been. But in Admiral William Halsey's eyes, what mattered was the chance to destroy the last enemy carriers once and for all.
Permission to open fire, sir.
Fire when ready.
Blinded by the prospect of a decisive victory, Halsey took the bait. He ordered the entire Third Fleet. 6 large carriers, 5 battleships, multiple cruisers, and destroyers, north, abandoning the San Bernardino Strait and leaving the Leyte landing forces without cover. The trap worked. On October 25th, off Cape Engano, a lopsided battle unfolded. The Japanese force was practically annihilated. 4 carriers, a light cruiser, and several destroyers were sunk within hours. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors died in the aerial and naval onslaught. But Japan was not seeking to win. It wanted to distract its rival, and it succeeded. The diversion at Cape Engano not only sacrificed an entire fleet, it also laid bare the cracks in Allied command. The arrogance of victory can be more dangerous than enemy fire. Japan, though dying, still knew how to strike where it hurt most. And while flames rose over Luzon, a new battle was about to erupt. This time, against all odds, it would be Japan that sprang the ambush.
American landing forces in Leyte Gulf had been caught completely off guard. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. The force Halsey thought was retreating, in fact turned around, sailed all night through the San Bernardino Strait, entered the Philippine Sea, and steamed south toward Leyte Gulf early this morning. With Halsey's Third Fleet well north sinking carriers, Kurita reached the Gulf unopposed and is now bearing down on the American landing forces.
Before we reach that encounter, we must stop on the night of October 24th to 25th, 1944, when the Surigao Strait, a narrow throat of water south of Leyte, became a corridor of death. Japanese Admiral Shoji Nishimura led a squadron tasked with breaking into the Gulf and striking U.S. troops already established along the coast. But he did not know a mortal trap awaited him. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had set a perfect ambush. Using intelligence and positional advantage, he arrayed destroyers, PT boats, cruisers, and battleships along the strait. It was one of the few times in history when the crossing of the T was executed, a tactical formation that allowed full broadsides while the enemy could reply only with forward guns. And among the battleships waiting were West Virginia, Tennessee, and California, raised from the bottom of Pearl Harbor, old, scarred, and thirsty for revenge. All it took was the call to action for hell to break loose.
It was 3 a.m. Our destroyer squadron received orders that we were going to be the additional combat attack on the Japanese force. It involved a number of warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, probably one of the last great battles involving warships.
In total darkness, the first to strike were the destroyers and PT boats. From the shadows, they launched waves of torpedoes that tore into the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, breaking her in 2. U.S. cruisers lit the sea with crossfire, and the battleships, lined up like judges at an execution, fired without cease. Witnesses said you could not see the water, there was only fire. Nishimura's force was massacred. Ships sank wrapped in flames, men screamed among floating wreckage, and the water boiled under the shells. More than 3,400 Japanese sailors died within hours. Only a handful got away. The scene was so apocalyptic that even U.S. veterans described it with horror. It had not been a battle, but an open-air execution.
The Japanese ships were firing on us, and the shells were landing with huge splashes on all sides of the ship and in front of us. The ship was shuddering. We had to keep going. And because I was in the director, I'm hearing other ones say, wow, that was close. It all happens so fast, you don't think. You just want to do your job, get out. We went in fast, dropped our torpedo. We hit the Japanese battleship Fuso, broke it in half, and sunk it.
Surigao Strait was the last time battleships fought one another directly in naval history, and it marked the definitive extinction of surface warfare as it had been known for centuries. Japan lost almost its entire southern force, and with it, any hope of regaining the initiative. But as darkness devoured the Japanese fleet, Japan still kept an ace up its sleeve. At dawn on October 25th, 1944, while the U.S. Third Fleet chased empty carriers in the north, the true Japanese fist emerged through the San Bernardino Strait. It was Admiral Kurita's central force which, thanks to the deception maneuver, had remained intact after the Sibuyan disaster. Now its moment had come, led by Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever to sail the seas. Cruisers and destroyers followed in lethal formation with a clear objective: to destroy the support ships and massacre the Leyte landing force. Facing them stood only a handful of light escorts and destroyers from the unit known as Taffy 3. The Japanese seemed poised to sweep the board thanks to their deft strategy, but what followed at the so-called Battle off Samar defied all naval logic.
Battle of Leyte Gulf, the greatest sea battle ever seen in mankind's history. Kurita came through, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. And there over the horizon, they see the flat tops of Taffy 3. Taffy 3 saw those pagoda masts coming over the horizon. All they could think of was doom. We will not live to see the end of this day.
Even with inferior guns, no real armor, and virtually no heavy air support, the men of Taffy 3 chose to fight. There was no possible retreat. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Ernest E. Evans, was the first to charge. He hurled himself at a line of battleships like a frenzied warrior. He fired torpedoes at close range, dodged fire as best he could, and struck where it hurt. He was hit multiple times, but he kept fighting until he went down. Evans died on the bridge, giving orders with his last breath and becoming a legend. He was not the only one. Other destroyers and escorts followed his example. Smoke screens, torpedo runs, desperate fire from 5-inch guns against steel giants. The escort carriers' planes dropped bombs and strafed with ammunition that barely scratched enemy hulls. Even so, confusion, audacity, and chaos tilted the fight to the American side. The Japanese, disoriented, thought they were facing a far larger force. Some captains believed they were blundering into an ambush. Kurita, fearing a trap, gave the most unexpected order: retreat. Taffy 3 had done the impossible. They had faced Yamato and survived. They had halted the Japanese advance with courage and sacrifice. Many died, but their feat became one of the most heroic actions in naval history. Against all odds, David had stopped Goliath in the middle of the Pacific. Yet when steel no longer sufficed, Japan chose to play its final card: an attack in which the body itself became a weapon. The sky over Leyte roared with aircraft, explosions, and anti-aircraft fire. At sea, the smoldering remains of the battle off Samar drifted among corpses. The Japanese fleet was withdrawing, but the nightmare was far from over. The Japanese Empire still had one last move. Not a ship, nor a torpedo, nor a bomb. Men turned into projectiles. Desperation became strategy. It was the birth of the kamikaze.
We got to the Philippines, the kamikazes became quite frequent. You're literally on your own, and we didn't give it another thought till the Japanese wised up and decided to kamikaze us. During a kamikaze attack, being in the main battery director, we were on telescopes. Looked like he was coming right down our throat. I was kind of frightened. My heart was pounding. One looked like he was going to hit us. We kept hitting him, and I'm saying, well, God, this guy's going to hit us.
For the first time in the war, the Tokutai, the Special Attack Unit, was officially activated. Young pilots, some with barely basic training, were sent to deliberately crash into enemy ships. It was not an improvised maneuver. It was an organized, brutal, suicidal plan that showed how clearly Japan understood it could no longer match Allied strength. It could only terrorize it. The target was the small group of Taffy 3 escorts, still regrouping after the miracle at Samar. 6 escort carriers were attacked by waves of kamikazes. One of them, USS St. Lo, was struck squarely on the flight deck. The aircraft, carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, plowed through the hangar and triggered a chain reaction. Internal explosions split the ship from within. In minutes, she went down. More than 100 sailors died, and she became the first ship in naval history sunk by a suicide attack. But she was not the last. The horror multiplied in the hours that followed. Yamato, still visible on the horizon, loomed like a god of war watching the chaos unleashed by its winged shadows. US sailors looked to the sky with a renewed fear, not of combat, but of an enemy who was not coming back and had nothing left to lose.
I could see flecks of his wings breaking up, and then all of a sudden the ocean came into view, and it had crashed in the ocean. It was a new experience, trying to kill an opponent who only wanted to kill you and not survive.
The kamikazes would not change the course of the war, but they left a deep psychological scar. For the first time, the Allies faced a form of warfare that blurred the line between will and death. It was the climax of imperial desperation, a suicidal scream cast into the ocean. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had reached its darkest point. What came after was no longer combat, but ruins. The Japanese Empire began to die in the most brutal way. After Leyte, the imperial roar became an echo. Japan lost more than 10,500 men, and what remained of its fleet was reduced to skeletons, escorts without direction, carriers without planes, battleships awaiting their graves. Yamato, still imposing after Samar, would set out months later on a final suicide mission and would not return. What fell in Leyte Gulf was not just steel. It was an era. The empire that had challenged the entire Pacific lay broken, breathless, and without a future. The war would continue, but victory was no longer possible. From then on, for Japan, there were only shadows, suicides, and silence. And so we reached the end of our video. If you liked it, join us in our next episode as we continue exploring military history.